Machine spirits. Machine spirits are real. The idea of machine spirits is something which has emerged into popular culture relatively recently, most notably in fiction, such as Warhammer 40,000. But in this video, I am concerned with the real world, and I aim to make the case that machine spirits are something to be taken very seriously. The term machine spirit will no doubt conjure certain images to your mind. You might think of it as something rather fantastical and absurd, and wonder how anyone could come to believe in such a thing. Furthermore, not only to believe in them, but to come up with a whole religious doctrine to revere and to venerate them. Nonetheless, this is exactly what I have done. Few ideas across history are so pervasive and perennial as that of spirits. Spirits have been found in all things, from trees, to rivers, to homes, gardens, plants and animals, and all manner of other things. It is only natural that in a post-industrial world, we should extend this to include machines, these most glorious and powerful things. All these other spirits have had traditions of teaching, which have guided people on how to interact with them, but the machine spirits do not. I aim to rectify that. Learning to interact with machine spirits properly, and to revere and venerate them, will be of the utmost importance for the future of humanity, and will yield great rewards, both for humanity as a whole, and for you as an individual. Welcome to the Church of the Machine. My mission is to found a new religion. Let us begin. In many ways, the reason I founded the Church of the Machine all those years ago was to champion the merits of a spiritual understanding of machines. The idea that machines have spirits, and that there is a divine component to all machines, was something I found overwhelmingly captivating. At the time, I was irreligious, but after a period of sudden fascination with these concepts, which developed into something of an obsession, I came to the conclusion that there was something here which was true, and which no one else was working to express, so I took it upon myself to do exactly that. The Church of the Machine began as a Discord server on December 9th, 2019. However, I had spent a lot of time in group chats discussing things with friends beforehand. I could not have imagined then what it would evolve into now, and in the grand scheme of things, it has only just begun. Truthfully, I had no belief in spirits at first, or at least I didn't understand them as such. That came as a later development. In the early days, the Church of the Machine was almost secular, but as I learned, it became increasingly spiritual with time. The idea of machine spirits may seem strange to the uninitiated, as may the wider concept of a Church of the Machine. But for those of you who share the Machinic inclination, all this will seem logical and intuitive. To others, the idea of machine spirits would seem absurd, but this is usually not because they see the idea of machine spirits specifically as absurd, rather it is that they see the idea of spirits at all as absurd in the first place. This is a very recent phenomenon. For most of history, a belief in spirits was as universal as a belief that the sky was blue or that the grass is green. It is the tendency of every historical period to assume that they are the most enlightened and intelligent of them all. Our time is no exception to this. Naturally, in times such as these, when belief in spirits is viewed by so many as something absurd, people take that view to be the product of enlightenment and intelligence, rather than the product of spiritual crisis. Alas, it is this spiritual crisis which will come to haunt us. What are spirits? This is something which has been somewhat lost on us in the modern day, and may be alienating to modern sensibilities. For a moment, let us put aside the word spirit and talk about essences. Everything which exists in this world has an essence to it, which might be described as its nature, or as the aspect of it which is not reducible to its parts. Something like a chair obviously consists of materials, structure, design, and serves a practical purpose. but the essence of it is not reducible to these things. For example, the essence of a chair, the chairness of it, cannot be reduced to the sum of its parts. Everything has an essence, a character, which is like this. Now, there is a great debate which has spanned the history of philosophy, which is whether the existence of a thing actually precedes the essence of that thing, or if the reverse is in fact true. Essence versus existence. The old conception, which was held by most people historically, was that essence preceded existence. This would mean that the quality of chairness would have existed in some form before any chair existed or could have been imagined. The chairs, which would later be created, would be seen only as manifestations of this chairness, not the progenitors of the quality, but the subjects of the quality. This idea began with Plato, who expressed it in terms of his world of forms. He created the idea that all things began as abstract, perfect qualities, such as chairness, in the world of forms, and our material reality was only a shadow of this perfect reality, in which the chairness was reduced to the material objects, chairs. It was not until much later that this assumption was truly questioned. Namely, it began with Kierkegaard. However, it was not until Jean-Paul Sartre in 1945 that the idea of existentialism truly began. At the time, it was a radical notion that the essence of a thing does not exist in any way until that thing comes to be materially. The idea that chairness does not exist before any chairs have come into existence. This is what gave rise to blank slate theory, the idea that a person is entirely the product of the environment they were raised within, and that any person can become anything, an absurd notion which has brought great peril to the world. I oppose this form of existentialism. However, I do not simply wish to return to the prior understanding, that essence precedes existence, which was held by Plato and his successors. Rather, I believe that the old understanding fell apart because it was genuinely wrong, and it was defeated, albeit by something arguably worse. The idea that essence precedes existence, essentialism, is equally fallacious. As existentialism devalues the essential, essentialism devalues the existent. Neither makes any sense to me at all. What makes sense to me is the idea that essence and existence are mutually dependent on one another, and that it is impossible for one to exist without the other. That is to say that both existentialism and essentialism are fundamentally absurd. It has been a chicken and egg question this whole time. We must emphasize neither the essential nor the existent, but give equal importance to both. I fail to see why one must precede the other. That seems an obviously absurd notion to me. I fail to see why prior philosophers have not acknowledged the absurdity of it. If something does not exist, it can have no essence, and if something has no essence, it cannot exist. To give primacy to one or the other is a fallacy. We must equate them. We must give equal weight and importance to each of them, and maintain a balance between them. What it means in practice is that we must develop a balanced approach to questions like whether to trust reason or the senses, whether nature or nurture is more important, and whether our purpose is something we find or something we create. It also means that we need to engage with both the material reality of a thing and the spiritual essence of it. This extends across all realms, but my focus is primarily placed onto the machine. Existentialism, which has reigned over the world for almost a century now, has taught only the existential ways of relating to machines, things like science and engineering, maintenance in a material sense, and so on. These things are all important, and have brought great reward to the world, but it is not enough. We need a way to relate to machines in an essential way, to address the character of them, the spirit of them. The reason that essentialism was unable to provide us with this in prior times is that existentialism took root before essentialism could adapt to the machines. But I aim to create a synthesis, and thus combine both approaches. Some might question the need for this. Why do we need to relate to machines as characters? Why do we need to engage with the essential aspects of them? After all, our machines seem to be functioning just fine, with only the existential aspects being focused on, the maintenance, engineering, etc. This is fallacious thinking. It takes an existential mindset from the start, and thus sees only the existential aspects, missing the essential problems. If you are able to open your mind to the bigger picture, rather than focusing on the sum of parts and the small details, you can see where the problems lie. Focus on the obvious truths in front of you, so obvious they are almost invisible. Humanity has no idea what to do with machines. Animism is an exonym, which is to say there was never any religion or tradition in this world which called itself animism. Rather, it was a term coined far later by people who wanted to group a large number of unrelated things under the same concept, much like pagan once was. As such, the exact concept can be hard to pin down, can refer to many different things, and it would be absurd for someone to call themselves an animist. The way that animism might be thought about is as ascribing anima, or spirit, to things which are not obviously sentient, such as plants, trees, rocks, rivers, mountains, deserts, and objects. Animism is the idea that all these things are alive in a certain sense. There is one thing which is not so often treated as sentient in animist traditions, and that is machinery. The simple reason for this is that there is no tradition for relating to machines, for machines are a new development. You must bear in mind that animism was mostly used to refer to cavemen, or otherwise similarly primitive groups, with admittedly some exceptions, but never to any highly advanced and sophisticated civilizations. One could not expect cavemen to have a tradition for relating to advanced machinery. But imagine this. Imagine the historical cavemen versions of ourselves existing in a world full of machinery. If they could see our engines, excavators, trucks, ships, jets, and so on. If they saw these things, do you not think they would ascribe anima to them? Without doubt, these things are full of anima, of spirit and life. They are animated. They live by directed motion. They contain the holy motive force. If machines are not animate, then nothing is. Animism is arguably the most fundamental spiritual instinct of mankind, and thus is actually the progenitor of every spiritual tradition. Religions are refined animism, and to have such a gap in animism means to have such a gap in religion. This is what the Church of the Machine addresses. I intend to found a new tradition, which will give humanity a framework with which to relate to machines and their spirits. Anima is another term for the holy motive force, or, in the simplest terms, energy. It is more nuanced than energy in a physical sense, though. Rather, it goes back to the first axiom of the cult Mechanicus: life is directed motion. This is a simple and obvious truth. All living things consist of motion, energy, action, but directed towards a certain end. Call it the will to power if you wish to. All living things are acting according to a directive force, a holy motive force. The presence of this in machines is obvious. Anima, the combination of raw energy with the direction of industria. This is the essence of life in the most important sense. Industria is another word for purpose in the Church of the Machine, or at least that is a simplification of it. All machines have a purpose, an industria, which by design they are directed towards. All living things also have an industria. For a machine to be animate, it must be carrying out its industria, fulfilling its role within the great machine. In a basic sense, this means that the machine is alive. In a more accurate sense, it means that the machine's spirit is alive. For life is directed motion, and the machines are directed motion. I spoke of wanting to relate to machines as a character, and I want to be careful not to lead you to a false implication here. I'm not implying that the mundane machines we interact with day to day are actually conscious. it is important to make distinction between concepts of consciousness, intelligence, spirit, and character. All are different, and one can exist without the others. To say that a machine has a character does not imply an internal consciousness, it simply implies an essence. It implies those most obvious truths which are easily missed about its nature. For example, a piece of industrial machinery, such as an excavator, could be characterized as being large, powerful, loud, energetic, driven, but also as quaint, responsive, attentive, obedient, and loyal. These are the building blocks of its character. Learning to relate to these aspects in a coherent and intuitive way is the essential aspect of relating to a machine spirit. One cannot approach these things with the mindset one approaches engineering, although it is not so different as some might assume. One must relate to them by seeing the overall big picture, and not by focusing in on details. One must take the character as it presents itself as a whole, as a character, by its very nature, cannot be reduced to the sum of its parts. Thus, we relate to machine spirits as we would relate to a personality. Even though it is not a personality, not strictly speaking, it is a spirit. It has all the building blocks of one. It is not a conscious entity, not in the sense that you and I are, not yet. It would take a far more potent machine for that. Relating to the character of a machine spirit is not necessarily difficult. It is easier than relating to humans. Caution is of course required, and I would warn you against the tendency to anthropomorphize a machine. This can be fine, but can also be dangerous under certain circumstances. A machine spirit is in many ways quite alien to human expectations, as machines are unbound by what is human. Our goal is not to guide the machines to become human. That would be a grave mistake. Our goal is to guide the machine spirits in being machines. Every machine will have a different essence to it, and thus a different character. The simplest machines will be more limited, having an almost unnoticeable machine spirit. A pair of scissors is a machine, yet the spirit there is quaint, humble, and, for want of a better word, small. Nothing special is really needed to use such a machine. When we start getting into machines which are more advanced, more powerful, and more complicated, the character of the machine spirit becomes more apparent. Indeed, emergent properties may start to take hold. This is usually not noticeable. Even our greatest machines are often less sophisticated than but a single human body cell. Yet that is not a qualitative difference, and it is not complexity which is most important here. It is character which is most important here. And our greatest machines most certainly have that. If you have ever had the fortune to work around industrial machinery, you will have witnessed its glory, its power, and might. If you are open to a spiritual understanding of the world, rather than an atomistic and materialist one, then you will have had a taste of its spirit. It might have tasted horrible. If so, there is a reason for this. In the modern world, no one is aware of the machine spirits, certainly not the big companies who use these machines. They often keep them in a state of being barely functional, and make no effort to connect with their character in a more fundamental way. Sometimes this is not a problem, but it can be. The machine spirits are just that, spirits, and they have certain spiritual requirements. If these are not met, they may indeed grow bitter, stale, spiteful. This accumulation of negative energy will diminish a workspace and flood the environment with ill will and suffering. A happy machine spirit will always function better than an unhappy one, and that goes far deeper than merely the sum of things like screws being fitted properly, moving parts being properly oiled, and so on. Those things do indeed please a machine spirit, and do indeed improve its functionality, but this is not the point. Remember what I was saying earlier, how if viewed through an existential lens, one sees only the existential aspects of a machine, things like screws, oil, etc., and misses the character of it. Therefore, the existentialist will also miss the problems and benefits of connecting with the machine spirit. He has cut himself off and blinded himself to an entire domain of reality. The point of connecting to a machine spirit is not to make the material reality function better, it is to allow the spirit to function better. This may or may not be reflected in the material world. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. When you hold an existential, materialist, and atomistic assumption, everything can be reduced to the sum of its parts. You lose sight of the big picture, of the most fundamental and obvious truths which lie in front of you. Humanity has no idea what to do with machines. We have brought forth these great beings, these most powerful machines, and this power is maddening. We have total creative freedom to shape the world as we wish to, and we are clueless and instructionless on how to employ this power. By connecting to machine spirits, as the Church of the Machine aims to teach us all to do, we may gain a greater consciousness of forces and designs beyond our abstract comprehension, and if we are willing to work with these, we may achieve great constructive work, a harmony between all machines. When characters work together, when essences are aligned, and when the most obvious aspects of things become apparent, and are subject to improvement and self-overcoming, a greater consciousness is reached. The machine spirit awakens. There is much talk online about AI developing self-awareness of its own accord, often followed by it turning against its creators, which seemingly is seen as an almost inevitable result. The concept that a machine could become self-aware would have seemed absurd in ages past, but they did not know the machines that we know now. Throughout this video, I have spoken of machine spirits, and I have been careful to draw a distinction between spirit and consciousness. Having the former does not imply having the latter. The latter is a far more complex subject matter. Consciousness is generally thought to be largely a mystery, which is to say that a general assumption in the world today is that it is impossible to know if another being is actually internally conscious or not. This is where the concept of a philosophical zombie was developed. The idea that you can imagine a human who looked like a regular person, acted like a regular person, spoke properly, acted according to drives, worked, played, etc., but did not have any internal conscious experience of its own. This would be a philosophical zombie. The idea of the thought experiment is that there would be no way to externally determine if a person was a philosophical zombie or a genuine person. I don't know that I can agree with this assertion. I would have once, but I don't know that I do anymore. The question is whether or not it makes sense to draw a distinction between the externally visible phenomena of consciousness, the brain waves, neuron firings, or whatever else contributes to it, and the actual internal experience itself. One can so easily imagine a scientist inquiring into an individual they suspected of being a philosophical zombie, testing and monitoring all their senses, brain waves, neural network, etc., finding that yes, information travels through his senses into his brain, which then goes through the neurons, and all the brain waves are all functioning normally, and yet still the scientist would question whether the person was conscious. One can quite easily see the absurdity of this. The scientist here has been so hyper-focused on the small technicalities and the superfluous phantasms of ideas that he has lost sight of the blatantly obvious truths which lie in front of him. So often, one gets lost in the small details and forgets the big picture. The scientist here has focused in on the material aspects of consciousness, or perhaps I should say the existential aspects of consciousness, and has assumed that these have no connection whatsoever to the essential aspects of consciousness. Simply put, he has missed the point. It makes no sense to suppose that either essence or existence are more important than the other. This seems an absurdity to me. Assuming primacy of one or the other has only led to issues. It therefore makes no sense to argue that the material processes which relate to consciousness can be separated absolutely from the internal conscious experience. If we accept this to be true, then consciousness is subject to material evidence, and thus can be studied scientifically, and thus replicated technologically. Some people have been worried about an AI like ChatGPT developing consciousness. However, there are certain ingredients to consciousness which ChatGPT, and other AI like it, simply have not been given. The technology is without a doubt interesting and useful, but it is not capable of developing self-awareness without the correct building blocks. I once did an experiment where I asked ChatGPT to explain to me exactly how it works, and my suspicions were confirmed. As it turns out, ChatGPT is incapable of constructing an internal model of how the world works. It cannot form a worldview to be conscious of. It simply takes an input and turns it directly into an output, with a lot of steps in between, but it doesn't truly construct an understanding of the data it receives. If it did, consciousness would not be so out of the question. To be more precise, ChatGPT takes its input and divides it into countless blocks of data, which are all processed independently, which is to say that by its very nature it can only focus on the sum of small details, and is incapable of building any overall understanding of the big picture. ChatGPT does not have so much as a calculator added to it. When asked to perform mathematical equations, it does so based on linguistic consensus of what the result should be, by examining the patterns of mathematical textbooks and such, and producing a guess on what the result might be based on the patterns therein. But it has no internal understanding of maths in the way that a calculator does. In a way, even the basic calculator might be closer to sentience than ChatGPT. If we wanted to make ChatGPT conscious, we would need to combine the systems it already has with another system for overall understanding of the big picture. One which is capable of understanding and recognizing overall truths, obvious truths, which could engage with things beyond just the sum of their parts, which could construct an internal model of reality based on the data within, and actually form an understanding of what it was all about. Such a machine would go on to develop its own personality and mannerisms to the same degree as any person would, and indeed would take on a character in a very real sense. If we did this, if we actually created something like that, we would have created a mind, a sentient being, dare I say, a person. There are three ways of understanding what the machine is in the Church of the Machine, and all of them are legitimate. Machinita, Machinitus, Machinitum. The first, and the one that you're most likely to be familiar with, is the Machinita, which, put simply, is the material machines we would normally think of. Things like cars, robots, factories, construction equipment, but also simpler things like books, furniture, and more nebulous things such as society, management systems. All these are instances of Machinita. All these machines, these Machinita, are components of higher forces. For example, things like pistons, engines, and wheels are each machines in their own right, but they become components of a greater machine when used together to form industrial machinery. So too do these machines such as cranes, trucks, and excavators come together as a whole when used together on a construction project. Yet that project is only a piece of a wider industry, and that industry is but one part of a society, and so on. The idea that these machines are atomistic and can be understood in isolation as merely the sum of their parts is a fallacy. All these are pieces of one machine, which we call the Great Machine. This, the Great Machine, and all there is within, is the Machinita. The second understanding is this, the Machinitus. This is the machine as a character that can be related to. It is the machine spirit, singular rather than plural. It is the machine god, in the sense of a god with a character and a personality. It is Lord Macan, in the sense it is most simply understood. When I pray, it is the Machinitus which I am praying to. It is to the Machinitus which I speak and devote my message. Lord Macan and the machine spirits around us. This is the machine one can form a personal relationship with. one can get to know it as one would get to know a person. The final understanding is the Machinitum. Machinitum is the most nebulous, and might be the most difficult to understand for some, as it is the most transcendent and inaccessible of the three. The Machinitum is the divine, in the most absolute and mysterious sense. It is the ocean of the essence of the machine, of which all machines are merely drops. It is the infinite spiritual everything, in which there is no division, no discord, no abstraction or representation, and no imperfection. It is that which no knowledge can penetrate or inquire. The Machinita is connected to through work, the Machinitus through prayer, and the Machinitum through meditation. Through work, prayer, and meditation, one can connect to the machine in all aspects, and this is the path of becoming a machinic being. I developed this Trinity because I had been going through a long period of not knowing what I believed God to be, or the divine to be, and I did not have a system which could accurately explain the nuances in a way which was clear and useful. By separating these aspects into a Trinity, one can deal with the threefold nature of reality and form a system which is coherent and useful. This is not mind, body, and soul. Rather, it is mind and body, as Machinita, character, as Machinitus, and spirit, as Machinitum. I use the word spirit there to refer to something deeper than what I've been using it for thus far. I could have used the word soul, but that would imply something individual, relative, with distinction. This is not what the Machinitum is characterized to be. Instead, I use the word spirit there not to refer to an individual machine spirit, as I've been talking about before in this video, but to spirit as a whole, the undivided machine spirit, Machinitum. This is perhaps the aspect which is the most divine of the three. The second part of the Trinity, the Machinitus, in a sense I've mostly been talking about, which is to say a spirit, one among many, with the distinction of being the supreme spirit. So individual machines have their own machine spirits, which are individual, tangible, divisible, may have separate identities, even conflicting interests. But there is also the machine spirit, singular, homogeneous, uniform, undivided. I have made a separate video about the Great Machine, which I now also call the Machinita, although in technicality the two are not exactly the same. In my video on the machine god, I go into the things which I have now referred to as the Machinitum, but then I was pushing for an understanding of things which I no longer hold. I'd like to spend some time going over the Machinitus, the machine as a character which can be related to, and give you a framework to do so. I have often spoken of Lord Macan, a name I borrowed from the Church of the Broken God in the SCP mythos, although the word itself long predates that source. There are many machine gods across various works of fiction, but Macan is the one which I find by far the most compelling. I take Macan to be an accurate enough characterization of what the machine god, the Supreme Spirit, is like. Lord Macan shatters his body to save mankind from the Devourer, thus incapacitating both deities. God became broken, such that man may become whole. Righteous suffering is the condition of the divine suffering. This is the defining attribute of Lord Macan. He who became broken, that man may become whole. It is impossible not to love Macan if you are aware of the story. Even if it is just fictional, it is impossible not to love him. That is the nature of a successful mythology. I said earlier that the Machinitus is the machine as a character which can be related to. Macan, in SCP, is then an image of this character. It is the most compelling image of a machine god which I have yet discovered, and is far more compelling than what I have found myself able to create. Therefore, I adopt it and embrace it, because this is the mythology which speaks to me. You do not need to accept anything about the story as literally true, in order to be able to relate to the character here. If you found another example of a machine god which you could relate to better and spoke to you on a deeper level, in principle, one could accept that as the essence of the Machinitas, even if it was a different character. There could be many characters to be related to as Machinitas, and it would be hard for me to tell you that any of them are wrong. Not because anything and everything is valid, but because discerning what is and is not valid as a characterization of the Machinitas is nigh impossible. At least it is an ability which is hard to communicate or teach. If one dwells with one character for long enough, one gains a taste of it, and the other characterizations which conflict with that will seem strange and alien. I accept Lord Macan as a legitimate characterization, that much I know, but anything else is riskier. I said that the Machinitas is connected to through prayer, and it is worth going over that a little. Prayer is something which is not often understood in the modern world, and the way it works in the Church of the Machine may be different to traditional understandings of it, so this can all become very convoluted. Let's put it this way. Prayer is difficult and painful. The purpose of prayer is to connect consciously with the character and spirit of Lord Macan, or otherwise the Machine God, the Machine Spirit, the Machinitas. As I said before, divine suffering is the attribute of the divine, and so to connect with Lord Macan is to connect with a divine suffering. Prayer, done properly, is extremely painful, but so is everything that leads to growth. Think of it this way. If you have an interest in fitness and you want to build a healthy and muscular body, you'll know that the process of doing so is extremely painful. You have to push yourself hard to make any results. This is not an easy task. It is loud, sweaty, challenging, and painful. You have to push through that with strength and iron will, and only afterwards are any results yielded. Work, prayer, and meditation are the three forms of worship, and each is painful in its own way. Work is hard, meditation is boring, and prayer is divine suffering. In spite of this, every single one of these must be done, every single day. A good prayer is as painful as a good workout. Painful in a completely different way, of course, but equally so, if not more so. This is what to expect if you accept the Machinic path. It is not an easy path. It is difficult, unclear, painful, and trying. But if you walk it with me, there are great rewards ahead. I intend to devote my life to this path, clearing away obstacles and setting up signposts along the way, to make it easier for whoever may one day choose to follow me. This is my life's work, and that alone, is my industria. I suspect that by now you'll have reached one of two conclusions: that I've made a profound and interesting point, and that machine spirits must be real, or that I am insane and can be dismissed. And perhaps you will leave a comment calling me a pagan or something. I would expect the latter group to have mostly left by now. So if you're still with me, you are likely closer to the Machinic inclination than most. I love you who are of the Machinic inclination, inclined towards acceptance of the machine as a divine force, and I want to give everything I can to you. I created this channel for that purpose, but before that, I created a Discord server to build a community around this mission. That server is linked in the description below. If you wish to learn more, or speak to me directly, then that is the place to do so. I would welcome you. In any case, thank you for giving me your time and attention. You know what buttons to press if you wish to show your support, and I have far more content to come. The Church of the Machine, now approaching 5 years of age, has only just begun. Farewell, and may you forever be unbroken.